Joseph Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in Günzburg in the Kingdom of Bavaria, in what was then the German Empire. He was the eldest of Karl and Walburga Mengele's 3 children. His father was the founder and owner of a flourishing agricultural machinery company. The name of Mengele was a symbol of success throughout Bavaria, to the extent that Adolf Hitler himself visited the family factory in Günzburg.
It gives him a lot of surety about what he wants to do. But he doesn't want to follow his family into agriculture. He wants to become a doctor. And of course, that's fully encouraged. That is a respectable profession.
Mengele was a good student, interested in music, art, and skiing. After secondary school in April 1930, he went to the University of Munich to study medicine. Munich was then the headquarters of the Nazi Party, run by Adolf Hitler. (1937) was a pivotal year for Mengele. In January, he became an assistant to Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, a leading advocate of the Nazis' racial medicine ideology. Ambitious and determined to climb higher within the Nazis' scientific establishment, Mengele also joined the SS.
For someone like Mengele, who is wealthy, smart, good at school, now he's a doctor, you look at the military organizations that the Nazis have, and the natural one to join would be the SS, because it was an elite within an elite. The SS went back 4-6 generations to make sure that you were pure German blood. There was a hereditary marker, so much so that joining Himmler's SS and that elite meant that you got a blood mark underneath your arm, so that it was the sign of your blood, that you had been vetted, that you were pure. Of course, for Mengele, he decided not to have that blood type tattoo because he was too vain to do it.
Mengele married in July 1939, just a few weeks before the outbreak of World War II. He was called up to the Wehrmacht in June 1940 and volunteered to join the Waffen-SS. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched an attack against the Soviet Union. Like thousands of other doctors, he was sent to the front. He was posted to the Ukraine, not far from Stalingrad. He was awarded an Iron Cross for bravery, but was seriously wounded in 1942 and sent away from the front with the rank of captain. Mengele was transferred to Berlin to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, where he was reunited with his mentor, Dr. Verschuer. In early 1943, he encouraged Mengele to ask for a transfer to Auschwitz, where he could pursue his research on human subjects and where his sinister reputation would be made.
The ones who flourished there were the true sadists, which there are some in human nature. They relished going there. And the others were, in a small group, men like Mengele, who viewed it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to advance the cause of what he viewed as racial science.
Auschwitz-Birkenau combined a concentration camp and an extermination camp. The inmates, mostly Jews, had been deported from around Europe and arrived in thousands every day by train. As they stepped from the train, they were sorted by SS doctors. Most of the new arrivals were sent directly to the gas chambers. Many of them were sick, or women and children. The others were herded into the concentration camp, where most of them died from exhaustion. It was during this selection process that Ruth Elias, several months pregnant, came across Mengele for the first time.
And Mengele was there, and some other SS people. And I saw from far that women, all naked, are going between two SS. And there Mengele stands and making right, left, right, left. And with his hand he waved. I didn't know this. Either life, death, life, death. It's very easy.
Unlike most of his colleagues, who regarded the selection as an arduous and unpleasant task, Mengele seemed to appreciate it. Prisoners often saw him smiling or whistling. And yet his subsequent experiments, focusing primarily on twins, had no regard for the health or safety of the victims.
Doctors today, in 2017, don't know why a woman, the egg splits into two, and some women most have one child and some have two. If he could unlock that secret, he was the father of Germany going forward. Every good German mother could have 2 children on every birth and replenish the war debt at a fast rate. It would be, for him, a brilliant accomplishment.
Vera Alexander, a deportee, recalls how he operated on twins in an attempt to join them together like Siamese twins.
Another SS man brought them back in a terrible state. They were cutted. The boy or the girl, the hunchback, was sewn to the other one, back to back. The wrist, back to back. It was a terrible smell also, already, gangrene. The cuttings were dirty, and the children did cry day and night.
For his efforts, Mengele was awarded the War Merit Cross and was promoted in 1944 to first physician of the Birkenau subcamp. In the winter of 1945, the ever closer Soviet forces put an end to the Auschwitz-Birkenau killing machine. Along with several other doctors, on January 17th, Mengele was transferred to the Gross-Rosen concentration camp in Lower Silesia. He brought along 2 boxes of specimens and records of his experiments. The Red Army captured Auschwitz on 27th of January. Mengele fled, abandoning his SS uniform and disguising himself as a Wehrmacht officer.
Mengele does appear on what's called a crocus list, an Allied wanted list, but it was a list of hundreds of people. Nobody knew if they were alive or dead at the end of the war, and the people who were on the list, except for the higher ranking, like Himmler, Hitler, Goering, the low people like Mengele didn't know if they were on the list or not. So when he fled, he didn't know he was wanted, but he knew enough to understand the significance of what took place. He may have been in denial and later tried to explain away what he did. He knew that Auschwitz was a murder center, the largest extermination center.
When he reached Germany, he was twice arrested by American troops in the spring and summer of 1945. He was even recorded under his real name. His decision not to be tattooed when he joined the SS saved his life.
They had POWs take off their shirts, raise their hands, and they walk by, and if you saw the blood type tattoo, you were sorted aside to be interrogated more closely. If you didn't have the blood type tattoo and you had a cogent cover story, then you could be released.
The SS doctor was ultimately saved by chaos and cunning. The Nazi war criminal was not identified and he slipped through the net. Joseph Mengele left the American camp under his real identity in July 1945. By chance, he obtained copies of the ID papers of another doctor he met in captivity, a certain Fritz Ullmann. He altered them slightly and became Fritz Hollmann. The name of Mengele was not widely known at the time, and although the Allies had established lists of war criminals as of 1943 and sworn to punish all of them, many managed to escape. Post-war Germany saw extensive denazification activity, but the means and resources available to Nazi hunters were limited.
The British war crimes team only had about kind of a handful of cars, they had about 2 photographers, and that's the British in their enormous zone of occupation, and for this they're trying to track down thousands of war criminals, thousands.
And yet Mengele's name was mentioned several times at the Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945. But the Allies knew dozens of Mengeles all over Germany. It was possible that he had died during the chaotic retreat of the German army, and indeed, this was what his family told GI investigators in the autumn of 1945.
Mengele's wife is said to have comported herself as a widow. I interviewed one woman in suburban New York who was from the town of Günzburg, and she said that there was a funeral mass for Joseph Mengele.
The whole Mengele family rallied round Joseph in his hour of need. They were all pro-Nazi, and beyond mere family ties, there were important economic issues too, concerning the survival of one of the region's leading families. For his own safety and that of the family, a hideout was found among some friendly farmers near Rosenheim in Bavaria. Officially, Joseph Mengele no longer existed. He was Fritz Hollmann, an agricultural worker who planted and harvested potatoes. His wife, Irene, visited him every 2 weeks. He would meet her at the station, and the couple would go for a walk along the river. Mengele spent 3 relatively tranquil years in anonymity until his fears were awakened once more. His name was mentioned during the trials of Nazi doctors in Nuremberg, which ended in late 1947.
Physicians, colleagues, people that he served with, that he knew, 3.5 years after the end of the war, going on trial with the death penalty there for doing the same things he had done, not just at Auschwitz, but at other camps, that he starts to think, you know what? This isn't very safe around here. Maybe I should get a little further away than Rosenheim.
Mengele limited his wife's visits to reduce the chances of being caught. His hopes of seeing his son Rolf, born in 1944, were dashed as the former doctor's anxiety grew. He had seen little of his son, and the trial of concentration camp doctors made the prospect increasingly risky. Fearing that his capture would mean a trial and a death sentence, Mengele began to plan his escape along with his family. South America was chosen as his destination, and specifically Argentina. But for a successful escape, a number of conditions had to be met. First of all, he needed new papers and a new identity. His new name, handily provided by the International Red Cross, was Helmut Greger.
This all looked like decent documentation. It was impossible to disprove that this man was somebody else. So therefore, getting your Red Cross papers in the absence of having an actual passport from a country was a relatively straightforward and simple thing to do. Don't also forget that as well as these Nazis escaping, you had millions of refugees and displaced persons all over Europe. It was a chaotic situation, even years after the war.
He was not completely reassured by this new identity, however, and it was imperative that he travel as discreetly as possible. Joseph Mengele, alias Helmut Greger, left Germany on April 17, 1949. His first objective was the port of Genoa in Italy. It was a long journey, over 1,000 kilometers, and filled with risks. There were 3 countries to cross: Germany, Austria, and Italy. But everything was carefully planned. At each step of the way, an accomplice would be present to guide Mengele. The first task was to arrive incognito at Innsbruck station in the Alps. He arrived there at the end of April 1949. The next stop was a small border town in the Brenner Pass, just a few hours' walk away from the town of Vipiteno, across the frontier in Italy. Crossing the border was dangerous and had to be done unseen. Early one morning in early May, making sure the weather conditions were good, he set off along a small winding mountain track. A few hours later, he was relieved to find himself in Italy. He stayed in Vipiteno for almost a month. At the end of May, he took a train, and after several stops, arrived in Genoa. In the vast port, the capital of Liguria, he could blend into the crowd among thousands of refugees waiting to set off towards various destinations in the New World. By chance, the ship Mengele intended to take, the North King, was still in the harbor. With his Red Cross papers and a visa for Argentina, he had no trouble boarding. After a crossing that lasted 6 weeks, he arrived in Buenos Aires. While he waited to meet the contacts he had been promised, Dr. Mengele took lodgings for a few days at the Hotel Palermo in the city center.
What nicer for a Nazi who wants to retire and not be found by Nazi hunting units than to escape to a country where there's a big German population?
Mengele soon made contact with Buenos Aires' Nazi support network. The first 2 people he met were ex-Nazi air aces, Hans Rudel, who would become a close friend, and Adolf Galland, who both lived in the Argentine capital. And so in the early 1950s, Mengele moved into the chic Florida neighborhood of Buenos Aires. He rented a house from a Nazi sympathizer at 2458 Calle Arenelas. At the beginning of 1953, the doctor moved again, taking an apartment in the city center at 431 Calle Tacuari. It was a strange choice. The charmless building was rather decrepit and the street was noisy. Perhaps at the age of 42, the lonely single man was looking for opportunities to meet women. We do know that he went out often and notably frequented a well-known Buenos Aires restaurant.
If you walked into the ABC cafe in downtown Buenos Aires in the 1950s, the Nazis gathered there would have been like a who's who of the Nazi regime. You would have had Mengele, you would have Eichmann, you would have had a lot of very, very senior figures, not the very top rank, but you would have had a lot of people who were maybe very high up in the regime or senior army officers, you know, all just having a beer, some traditional kind of Germanic food, and whether they all exactly knew who the other person was is difficult to say.
Mengele, alias Gregor, was far from inactive, and indeed began to make a living. With the help of his family, he invested in a carpentry business. Thanks to his friend Hans Rudel, he also developed the family agricultural machinery activity. Rudel notably put him in touch with contacts in neighboring Paraguay, where Mengele frequently traveled.
I think one of the greatest surprises to me in many years of research about Mengele was how easily he adapted to his new life and how he flourished in it. Mengele had money. That made all the difference in the world. Other criminals who escaped to South America, Adolf Eichmann, who ran the trains, was the traffic cop of death, as some people called him. He went to work, you know, as a foreman in an assembly line for Mercedes. Not Mengele. Mengele, as a matter of fact, didn't go to work for a 9-to-5 job. He, at first, didn't have a job at all, and then he starts to invest in some companies.
He was in constant contact with his family in Germany. In 1954, a court in Düsseldorf granted a divorce to his wife Irene, who had not accompanied him to South America. He agreed to the separation through his lawyer. Mengele's brother Karl had died in 1949, leaving a widow, Martha, and a son. Mengele knew that his father was worried that his daughter-in-law may remarry with someone unsuitable. She had stock in the family company. The solution to preserve the company would be for Martha to marry Joseph. The only problem was to organize a meeting between them. In order to do this, Mengele had to return to Europe and therefore renew with his real identity.
In 1956, he feels so comfortable in this new high life that he has in Buenos Aires. He walks into the West German embassy in Buenos Aires and says, by the way, my name isn't Helmut Gregor. That's the name I arrived on here. My name's Joseph Mengele. I'd like a German passport in my real name. Nobody there says, so you arrived here in 1949 under an alias and you want to go back to your real name. What's that about? No check. They issue it to him.
He first obtained a copy of his birth certificate via the West German embassy in Argentina in 1956. He then applied for an Argentinian residence permit and used this document to get an Argentine passport mentioning his real identity. The journey he made back to Europe, in retrospect, seems to have been extremely daring, if not foolhardy. In February 1956, he returned to the old continent as Joseph Mengele. He first went to the ski resort of Engelberg in Switzerland. At this hotel, he met his son, Rolf, and was introduced as Uncle Fritz. Martha and her son, Karl-Heinz, were also present. They all got to know one another in the idyllic Swiss-German alpine setting. Mengele then extended his stay with a visit to Germany with Martha.
He goes to Günzburg, he actually goes to Wiesbaden, and for 3 days he's visiting former colleagues at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, supposedly, and it would be very interesting to find out exactly what happened then.
On returning to Argentina in the spring, Mengele decided to live under his real name. In the summer of 1956, he went to the German embassy to review the situation vis-à-vis the German authorities. He intended to remarry and also to borrow money to invest in a new company. To do so, he needed a passport from his country of birth. A few weeks later, on September 11, 1956, he obtained the all-important document from the West German Republic. How was this possible? How could the diplomats be so negligent?
I don't believe there was any corruption, bribery, or that, because there didn't have to be. If you were a German diplomat, politician, doctor, lawyer, or businessman after World War II, 10, 11 years after the end of the war, the one thing that nobody in Germany ever asked anybody else is, what did you do during the war? It was considered a taboo question.
At the time, the Germans were not particularly determined to prosecute criminals who posed a problem for German society. Mengele was a doctor. Doctors who had obtained their qualifications quite legally, high-level intellectuals, they posed a problem for German society.
The Germans' negligence, tantamount to assistance, enabled Mengele to lead a normal professional life in Argentina. He personally invested in 2 pharmaceutical laboratories, over 1 million Deutschmarks, lent by his family. The doctor intended to pursue his passion, medical science. The offices were located in this Buenos Aires building.
Se conoce un primer emprendimiento que tiene que ver con su profesión.
The first business that concerned his profession was the Fadro Farm Laboratory. He made products for sale to the public, quite openly, under his real name. On these papers, which were presented for the establishment of the limited company, we can see the name Mengele.
I called him Dr. Gregor because that was how he had been introduced. And then he corrected me, telling me that it was Dr. Mengele and not Dr. Gregor. I was rather surprised by this, but he explained to me that he had got the name of Dr. Gregor when he left Germany after the war because of political problems.
Business was going well for Mengele, as was his family life. In October 1956, Martha and her son Karl-Heinz joined him in Buenos Aires. They moved into a new house the doctor had just bought for his family at Vire Vertis in the comfortable suburb of Olivos. The name Mengele even appeared in the Buenos Aires phone book. The couple were married in January 1958 during a trip to Montevideo, the capital of neighboring Uruguay.
Martha is a strong woman who he obviously always was attracted to, and she to him. And she has a son around the age of his real son, Rolf, who doesn't know until he's 14 years old that his father's even still alive. So before Rolf knows that his father's alive, Martha packs up, takes her son, moves to Buenos Aires, and marries Mengele. It's an astonishing bit of family dysfunction, with a capital D for dysfunction. And she's willing to be with him, and the son thinks he's a perfect person and a great father.
It was perhaps logical that Mengele could consider returning to Germany after several years in exile. He felt that he was not a wanted man, and that his real place was back in Günzburg at the head of the family business. But a number of events would put an end to any such considerations.
He had no doubt performed a number of clandestine operations. He'd even been denounced for doing an abortion on a teenage girl who died following an infection. He was arrested by the police. It's clear that he benefited from protection, however, as a situation that could have been fatal was somehow avoided. This shows the level of protection he had.
Mengele was only one of a number of doctors arrested. He was cleared, but shaken. Worried that the publicity would lead to his Nazi background and wartime activities being discovered, in late 1958, he took an extended business trip to Paraguay. Events in Europe would lead to further attempts to remain in hiding. The relentless efforts of Nazi hunters Simon Wiesenthal and Hermann Langbein were beginning to bear fruit. Langbein, a survivor of Auschwitz, had gathered extensive testimony concerning Mengele's activities during the war. In a search of the public records, Langbein found Mengele's divorce papers listing an address in Buenos Aires. He and Wiesenthal pressured West German authorities into drawing up an arrest warrant. On the 5th of June 1959, a court in Fribourg established an initial charge sheet against Mengele.
The prosecutor opens up a file and they investigate. So they send police officers, they ask the police force in Günzburg to investigate. Now, Günzburg is a company town, so the police, directly after that, Mengele is aware that they're searching for him.
Mengele was informed of the risks and fled. Germany's request for extradition was initially refused by Argentina, and when it was finally granted, Mengele was already living in Paraguay, where he was safe. The country was run by the dictator, Alfredo Stroessner, of German descent, and granted Mengele Paraguayan nationality in November 1959.
There was a moment somewhere in his mind where he thought he could live there as Jose Mengele. And once you are a citizen of Paraguay, they will never send a Paraguay citizenship.
At the same time, in 1959, unknown to everyone, the Israeli Secret Service, the Mossad, launched Operation Attila. They had located Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution. On May 11th, 1960, the former SS leader was captured in the street in front of his home in the Olivos neighborhood of Buenos Aires. Mossad agents hoped to make a second catch with Mengele, but he slipped through their fingers. They were unaware that he was already in Paraguay. But after this brazen, although illegal, action, the Israelis were wary of the Paraguayan authorities. And Sir Joseph Mengele was protected by his new nationality, even though he felt increasingly at risk.
From then on, he lived a life that was far different. And he, I think, lived in fear all the time about the possibility of being captured.
His old friend, the aviator Hans Ulrich Rüdel, put Mengele in touch with a Nazi sympathizer called Wolfgang Gerhardt, a former Hitler Youth member. He helped Mengele to secretly enter Brazil. Wolfgang Gerhardt found him a family to stay with. Geza and Gitta Stammer were Hungarian expatriates. Thanks to financial help from Mengele, the couple bought a farm at Nova Europa, 300 kilometers west of Sao Paulo. Gerhardt introduced Mengele to the Stammers under a new identity. The doctor was now using the imaginary name of Peter Hochbichler, supposedly a Swiss emigrant hoping to settle in Brazil. Mengele became a farm manager. In 1962, again with Mengele's funds, the Stammers bought a bigger farm at Serra Negra, 150 kilometers north of Sao Paulo. But the Stammers finally discovered his real identity. It was the first time Mengele was unmasked.
One day somebody left a newspaper, and there was an item of news about the Nazi executioners, as they called them. I saw this photograph there of a young man of about 30 or 33 years old, looking like this. Then I thought that this face was very familiar to me, with the smile and the gaps between the teeth.
I showed him the photograph and said, "Look at this photograph. It looks very much like you. You're so mysterious. You live here with us. So please be honest and tell us whether it's you or not." Later he said, "Well, you're right. I live here with you, so you have the right to know that, unfortunately, that person is me."
Mengele managed to convince the Stammers not to give him up, saying they may be accused of protecting him, but basically buying their silence. Witnesses noted Mengele's increasing paranoia at this time, as he felt increasingly hunted.
Wherever he went, the dogs were always with him. He had about 14 or 15 dogs, sometimes more, sometimes less. He didn't bring the dogs up here, but he used to come up here with me. He used to come up here with his binoculars to have a look round. I used to do the same.
Could you see the road from here?
Well, you could see a good way. The line of the road is quite clear from here.
At the same time, informed that the fugitive may have found refuge there, the German authorities extended the arrest warrant to cover Brazil. Zvi Aharoni, one of the agents who took part in the capture of Adolf Eichmann, was put in charge of a new team entrusted with finding and arresting Mengele. His men followed a new lead revealed by a former Nazi of Dutch origin named Willem Sassen. The net was closing in.
He was one of these freelancers in South America who knew a lot of people. And when the Israelis picked him up, they said essentially, "Oh, we're going to take you back to Israel like Eichmann." He was no Eichmann, he wasn't, but unless you give us some information that's useful. And the short and long of the story is that Sassens gave them a name related to Mengele, and the Israelis let him go. He said, "I'll tell you the name. It's a guy called Gerhard. He's a big 6'3" sort of Austrian German. He knows about Mengele."
Wolfgang Gerhard was placed under surveillance. One day he traveled to the rural region of Serra Negra. The Mossad team spotted a European man who could well be the man they had been looking for months.
It was quite difficult to shadow this place and to photograph it, but we tried to do our best. We used some native Brazilians. We dressed them up in simple clothes. I remember one guy walked without any shoes on for 5 miles just to show that he's a local guy. And as I said, at one occasion, whilst driving with a local man on the sand track leading to this group of houses, I met a man who I now believe to be Mengele, because I now saw his pictures in the German television, and it was the same man.
The agent immediately informed his superiors, but the complex logistics, financial limits, and more pressing priorities closer to home led the Mossad chiefs to abandon the operation. Once again, Mengele managed to wriggle free. In 1969, Mengele and the Stammers bought a new house at Caieiras, about 100 kilometers north of Sao Paulo. It was a large villa on top of a hill, surrounded by land. All three wanted to move closer to the city while working the land, and Mengele no doubt wanted to keep changing location. In 1971, when he left for Europe, Wolfgang Gerhard gave his ID card to Mengele, and he changed identity once more, his fifth since 1945. But far from being reassured, the doctor felt more and more vulnerable. Mengele became irritable, and after 12 years, relations with the Stammers seriously deteriorated.
Some days he didn't say a word and was very thoughtful.
Pensativo, fazia tudo, fazia o trabalho.
He would get on with his work and carry out all his duties, but he would keep very quiet. He began to go for long walks. He'd walk for hours and hours. Other days he would be more talkative, be quite happy and get on better with everybody. But suddenly he would start quarreling and complaining again.
Following an argument in late 1974, due perhaps to the aging doctor's unpleasantness and his relationship with Gitte Stammer, the trio split up. For the first time since Argentina, Mengele, alias Gerhard, was on his own. He moved into this modest house at 55 Calle Alvarenga in the poor El Dorado quarter in the suburbs of Sao Paulo, alone among a mixed Brazilian population.
So the very smart move, in many ways, is to move to the edge of one of the most populous cities in all of Brazil, in one of the poorest neighborhoods, and mingle in and mix in. Live in open sight, hide in open sight, but with so many people around you that nobody thinks that you are that person.
In an attempt to reassure Mengele, and in exchange for ever larger sums of money, Wolfgang Gerhard introduced him to a new family, Wolfram Bossard, his wife Lieselotte, and their two children, Andreas and Sabine. They lived in Sao Paulo, about 30 kilometers from Mengele.
Now in the 70s, it's 30 years after the end of the war, they thought that it was a persecution against Mengele that he was still wanted. So they had turned this protection not into just something that was shameful, but they were doing the honorable thing in their view.
The two men got along well, and the Bossard children were a source of relief for Mengele. He spent a good deal of time with the family. We have found a unique sound recording of Joseph Mengele's voice from this period. He is at the piano, singing a song for his new friends. He also looked after the children. He made a boat for them and took them fishing, becoming a substitute uncle. Thanks to the Bossards, he had a social life again. He felt protected, even as his name was talked about around the world. Mengele's health had been failing since 1972. He suffered a stroke in 1976. He had high blood pressure and an ear infection that affected his balance. His family and Germany were concerned. In 1977, his son Rolf decided to visit him. He had not seen his father since Mengele's trip to Europe in 1956, 21 years before. He traveled incognito, using an assumed name.
In the first days of our meeting, I avoided to speak about problematic points, as it is Auschwitz. Then later on, I came to this. As I told you, he exploded. How can you imagine that this is possible for me to do these things? Don't you see at the first line this is a lie or propaganda?
It does not make Rolf turn around and turn his father in. To this day, he condemns what his father did, vociferously condemns it, but says to this day, I still would not turn my father in. I think Rolf was also doing it for his mother Irene, who was alive, who he had a very close relationship with then, and knew that if his father was caught and on trial, she would be in the middle of the maelstrom.
On February 5th, 1979, Mengele caught a bus to the coastal town of Bertioga to join his friends, the Mossads, on vacation. They often came here to cool off during the hot Brazilian summers. On February 7th, 1979, as he was swimming, Mengele had a heart attack.
It was around 4:30 when we went down to the beach for a swim. Suddenly, my son noticed that the uncle, Mengele, was lying lopsided in the water, and I saw him too. I called to my husband that something was wrong with the uncle. His head was half out of the water, and it was clear that he was struggling desperately. His eyes were fixed and staring, and he looked determined to swim back. My husband tried to get to the beach with him.
Mit ihm zusammen dann an den Strand zu kommen.
Mengele died without seeing his son or family again. He was buried anonymously, in great secret, in the municipal cemetery in Embu das Artes. His grave was next to that of Frederica, the mother of Wolfgang Gerhardt, whose identity he had been using since 1971. There was no inscription and no headstone to indicate the presence of a second body.
Some people who shielded Mengele could be subject to prosecution in Brazil or elsewhere, and so the family felt that it would be better to delay that confirmation, that revelation, as long as possible.
There was a total blackout. No one spoke of the death. Interest in Mengele was only revived in 1985, when a mock trial was held to commemorate the liberation of Auschwitz. Survivors sought justice against Mengele, and several countries were made aware that he may still be at large. The scandal led the West German, Israeli, and American governments to combine their efforts to find Mengele once and for all. Rewards for his capture were offered by Israel, West Germany, the Washington Times, the Klausfels, and the Simon Wiesenthal Center.
There's a lot of pressure on Germany to finally do something, find out if this guy is alive or dead, do something. And the West Germans finally kicked off the investigation that should have been kicked off 15 years earlier.
On May 31st, 1985, acting on a tip, police raided the house of Hans Sedlmayr, a lifelong friend of Mengele and sales manager of the family firm in Günzburg. They found a coded address book and copies of letters to and from Mengele. Among the papers was a letter from Bossert notifying Sedlmayr of Mengele's death.
They go in and they search, and pretty quickly, it didn't take long. They're looking in Mrs. Sedlmayr's bedroom, and they discover in some wall cabinet or something, poorly disguised, a bunch of letters. This was a surprise to everyone who found it. It was a big surprise to Hans Sedlmayr, who at least reportedly told people afterwards that his wife was so stupid that she had kept these letters.
German authorities immediately notified the police in Sao Paulo, who contacted the Bosserts. Under interrogation, they revealed the location of the grave. The remains were exhumed in public on the 6th of June 1985. The cemetery in Embu attracted the world's press. Specialists from around the world helped Brazilian forensic examiners to confirm with a high degree of probability that the body was Mengele's.
And in the end, when those forensics experts, 11 of them from Germany, the United States, Israel, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, all signed off, agreed that based upon his SS records, yes, some people debated osteomyelitis and other conditions, but agreed that this was Mengele with certainty.
On June 10th, 1985, the only member of the Mengele family to speak was Rolf. He issued a statement on the 10th of June, admitting that the body was his father's. He said that the news of his father's death had been kept quiet to protect the people who had sheltered his father for so many years. Many people, however, continued to have their doubts.
And then a few years later, it was done by a British DNA pioneer called Jeffries, and it was he who finally proved by using DNA from the Mengele family that these bones 100% belonged to Mengele.
The man who remains a sinister symbol of the greatest horrors perpetrated by Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime lies today in a drawer at the Sao Paulo Legal Medical Institute. Ironically, even his own family did not want a decent grave for him. After the war, very few Nazis of his importance escaped justice. Mengele was a rare exception. The hunt for the Auschwitz doctor was too late and inadequate. In general, however, in view of the scale of Nazi crimes and the sheer numbers of the criminals involved in the unprecedented horror, justice can be said to have been done in most of the cases of crimes against humanity.